Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. Today, we're continuing our ongoing coverage of the war between the Russian Federation and the Ukraine. Now, first, what I want to read to you is a interaction between media and the Russian government over reports that long-range Western weapon systems like the Storm Shadow, the JASM, will be introduced into this conflict beyond what it's already being used for in terms of striking targets in Crimea. And we're talking about striking targets much deeper inside the Russian Federation. Now, this article on September 12th, 2024, following his address to the plenary session of the United Cultures Forum, Russian President Vladimir Putin answered a question from a media representative relating to the fact that the UK and the United States may allow Ukraine to strike targets deep inside Russia using Western long-range weapons. Putin stated the following: "If the decision is made, it will mean nothing short of direct involvement. It will mean that NATO countries, the United States, and European countries are parties to the war in Ukraine. This will mean their direct involvement in the conflict, and it will clearly change the very essence, the very nature of the conflict dramatically. This will mean that NATO countries, the United States, the European countries, are at war with Russia. And if this is the case, then bearing in mind the change in the essence of the conflict, we will make appropriate decisions in response to the threats that will be posed to us." Here was the question that was given to Vladimir Putin. Over the past few days, we have been hearing statements at a very high level in the United Kingdom and the United States that Kiev will be allowed to strike targets deep inside Russia using Western long-range weapons. Apparently, this decision is either about to be made or has already been made. As far as we can see, this is actually quite extraordinary. Could you comment on what is going on? And this is the response from Putin. What we are seeing is an attempt to substitute notions, because this is not a question of whether the Kiev regime is allowed or not allowed to strike targets on Russian territory. It is already carrying out strikes using unmanned aerial vehicles and other means. But using Western-made long-range precision weapons is a completely different story. The fact is that I have mentioned this, and any expert both in our country and in the West will confirm this: the Ukrainian army is not capable of using cutting-edge, high-precision long-range systems supplied by the West. They cannot do that. These weapons are impossible to employ without intelligence data from satellites, which Ukraine does not have. This can only be done using the European Union satellites or U.S. satellites in general, NATO satellites. This is the first point. The second point, perhaps the most important, the key point even, is that only NATO military personnel can assign flight missions to these missile systems. Ukrainian servicemen cannot do this. Therefore, it is not a question of allowing the Ukraine regime to strike Russia with these weapons or not. It is about deciding whether NATO countries become directly involved in the military conflict or not. If this decision is made, it will mean nothing short of direct involvement. It will mean that NATO countries, the United States, and European countries are parties to the war in Ukraine. This will mean their direct involvement in the conflict, and it will clearly change the very essence, the very nature of the conflict dramatically. This will mean that NATO countries, the United States, European countries, are at war with Russia. And if this is the case, then bearing in mind the change in the essence of the conflict, we will make appropriate decisions in response to the threats that will be posed to us. Well, there you have it. Here is the JASM. This system will have the ability to strike targets in Moscow. The Storm Shadow. It is believed that the Storm Shadow could actually strike as far or close to Moscow, meaning the range, the publicly stated range, is actually less than what the actual range of the Storm Shadow is. Now, look, we've already seen the Ukrainians / North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the United States, conduct a very sophisticated strike against targets in Sevastopol, in the Crimean Peninsula. The Russians are not going to give back the Crimean Peninsula. That is just, it's not going to happen. And the strikes that have been launched by the Ukrainians against targets in Sevastopol by the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, these were very sophisticated strikes. These were not just strikes using Storm Shadows. This was a full-on strike package involving drones, involving the use of decoy missile systems, the use of Western radar jamming and signals jamming systems. A very sophisticated strike. So when you're looking at these attacks that are being prepared, attacks much like the attack on targets in Sevastopol that occurred, these are going to be very sophisticated operations, not just by the Ukrainians. And this is what you have to understand. These are going to be a tandem operation. These are going to be operations launched by both the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and the Ukrainians. These missions and these strike packages is just not an issue of a couple of Ukrainian Su-24s or MiG-29s taking off and launching a handful of Storm Shadows at targets inside of Russia. It's not the way it works. In all probability, there are going to be other systems involved. Now look, the Ukrainians are operating the F-16, Western American piece of equipment. What does that do? Well, it gives the Ukrainians, it gives the West, it gives the United States, it gives NATO plausible deniability. Plausible deniability. Again, these are going to be very sophisticated strike packages. In all probability, they will be both Ukrainian and they will be also NATO assets involved in these strike packages inside of Russia. So when Western systems are used and are spotted on radar, spotted on satellite, well, the West will simply say, "Oh, those are Ukrainian F-16s. They're not ours." but believe you me, they are. They are, and they will be. And unfortunately, he's absolutely right, meaning Vladimir Putin, in terms of the technology that it's being handed over, this is not the Ukrainians striking Russia. This is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization striking Russia. The intelligence information that's being used to acquire targets inside the Russian Federation is coming from NATO. the jamming systems, the decoy systems, the planning, the inputting of target data, all of that is coming from the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So why is this happening? Why is this happening? Well, desperation. Desperate times call for desperate measures. Look, the Western allies have attempted this Kursk incursion, hoping that it would remove the ongoing collapse of the Donbass front, which could very well mean the collapse of the entire Ukrainian military in the southeastern theater of operations. The Russians didn't bite. The Russians have decided to say, okay, well, you can do what you're doing. You can occupy these potato fields, and we will just bomb you. And we're going to continue on with our military operation that's taking place in the Donbass. This is Pokrovsk. Pokrovsk Falls, key transportation hub. We could see the general collapse of areas both south and northeast of Pokrovsk. This is a serious issue for both the Ukrainian military and its Western handlers. This means a serious military defeat, a serious rethinking of what happens next. And that what happens next is the possibility of falling back west of the Dnieper River. That could be the next fallback line. So again, these are desperate times, calling for desperate measures. So what happens? NATO decides to start striking targets inside of Russia. Then what happens? How does Russia respond? Does Russia strike a NATO client state? Then what happens? Well, you're looking at then possibly the direct introduction of NATO troops to try and prevent the collapse of the Donbass theater of operations. Because at that point, NATO will be able to create the perception that it is now at war with the Russian Federation. And this continues to escalate. And that's where we're at right now. That is where we're at. So that does it for today. Obviously, thank you for joining us. We will have more very, very soon. As always, have a good day.